Relax. It's ASMR. Hello everyone. Well, today's video, I thought I would take you all through some of the books that I am using to write my thesis to finish up my master's degree. This is a portion of them. I have several that are like on my iPad that would kind of be awkward to show. I'm just flipping through, but I may do that for like a separate video because I want to focus on books and pages and page turning and kind of just generally talking about the books. Most of these I have read at least part of. There's a few that I haven't gotten to yet, but I thought it would be fun to take you guys through the books and pages and the thoughts that are going through my head, since that is what is occupying my brain at the moment. So the starting point for this whole thesis is talking about the ideas that are in this book, which is written by John Calvin and is called The Institutes of Christian Religion. I'm going to put these over to the side. It's kind of hard to see the cover here with the glare. There we go. It is a giant book with, as you can see, very dense type. And I am not reading this entire book. I have concentrated on just a few sections that relate to my topic. So, if you don't know who John Calvin is, he wrote during the Reformation. You all hear about Martin Luther as starting the Reformation with his 95 thesis, which he wrote against the Catholic Church. Followed closely after Luther was Calvin. Calvin was a little younger than Luther, and so he kind of came up just as the Reformation was really getting started. In between the two of them, they pretty much established the doctrines of the Reformation as we know it today. There were a lot of offshoots and a lot of other movements, but primarily as far as the biggest influence for the Reformation, it was Luther and it was Calvin. Calvin was a lawyer, and so he wrote in a very different style than Luther. Luther was very bombastic, somewhat crude, and definitely it was a challenge to kind of put up with his personality sometimes. Calvin was very methodical. And so this book is definitely a very methodical establishment of what he believed to be a more accurate following of the Christian religion, pulling it away from the Catholic Church and founding it on a different set of beliefs that took the Holy Scriptures of the Bible as the only thing that you needed to understand the Christian religion and to become a good Christian. Part of the Reformation movement was pulling away from a lot of the practices of the Catholic Church that they said that you needed to perform in order to maintain a right relationship with God and to ensure your salvation. Now, these are all principles that I agree with on the broad spectrum. I consider myself to be a Protestant I attend a Anglican church, which is a whole nother conversation. But I am not as antagonistic against the Catholic Church as someone who was coming from a purely Calvin Reformed standpoint would be. So, my critique of Calvin is not a complete dismissal of everything that he wrote in this book. It is much more of an evaluation of the ramifications of what he wrote in this book and how we see those ramifications played out in American Western Christian culture today. So, yeah, exciting stuff, I know, but this is an ASMR video, so maybe talking about things that help put you to sleep is not a bad thing. So, one of the main tenets of Calvin's theology was the fact that he believed that the free will of man to make choice was so corrupted and so tainted and bound by sin that it was, for all practical purposes, useless when it came to doing good. He believed that man could only do evil, and even if he did what we would consider as humans to be good, it was still considered to be evil in the sight of God. He had a very black and white way of thinking about the relationship between God and man. And he was very careful to establish in his doctrines the fact that man had no claim to his own salvation, to have really any part of even wanting salvation. That any inclination that man had towards that was given to him by the grace of God. So that the act of salvation was completely dependent upon the will of God to choose certain people over other certain people. And that's where I start to have some real problems with Calvin's theology. And the basis of my thesis is basically, if you take Calvin's logic to its logical conclusion, you end up with a very dark religion, and one that leaves very little room for human agency. And I ultimately believe that is unrealistic. It also leads to some very logical conclusions that you come to about God and his nature, which I think are not compatible with the true nature of God. Basically, it turns God into a monster, which says, I didn't give you a choice, but you're still responsible for the sin that you commit. Now, one of the reasons this book is so large is that Calvin makes logical arguments around that, trying to defend his position, because that was a huge criticism against him at the time that he was writing. And speaking of that, brings us to our next book. So this was the Institutes of Christian Religion that Calvin wrote. He wrote several versions of them. Throughout his life, he revised this document, this book, as he aged and as he thought more about his theology. This is a book that he also wrote, and it is in response to criticism of the Institutes. So this is kind of the base document of everything that he believed. And this book is a defense of this book. There was a man named Pygius, who wrote a 4-volume refutation of the Institutes. And so Calvin wrote The Bondage and Liberation of the Will as a response to this. So this is kind of a distillation of a lot of his thinking that is incorporated in this book. So this book is very valuable to me in the fact that it is quite a bit thinner, as you can see, but yet contains a lot of the same information, specifically around what I am interested in, that is in here. So I will be using this for reference from original statements of Calvin about the ideas, but I will also be pulling his clarifications and his defense of those ideas from this book. And I just got this book in yesterday because I have been reading it on my iPad. But the problem is when you read something in a digital format and then you need to reference it for a paper, is that you need to have page numbers. And for books that are like in Apple Books or in some of Amazon's books, that's usually fairly accurate as long as you're using a relatively normal font size. Because as you change the size of the font, you also increase the number of pages. So that's kind of a difficult thing to do. The app that I was reading this book on was changing the page numbers on me all the time. I would be reading and it would say like page 100. I would go check out another page and I would come back and it was now page 101 or page 99. And it was driving me crazy as far as trying to reference which page I needed. So I went ahead and bought this version, which is the paper version, which doesn't change. What is on page 100 stays on page 100. So I will be taking the notes that I have written about the iPad version and making underlines in this book and making sure that I establish an actual page number. And then when I do my bibliography for my final paper, I can reference this book in the hard copy as opposed to the digital copy, which should make things a lot easier. So I may do a video where I go through and underline the passages in this book that I find particularly pertinent to my arguments. So, in this book, Calvin is not kind to Pygius. He is very annoyed that someone would dare to critique him. And he kind of uses a little bit more harsh language when talking about Pygius. And so this is kind of basically a very long format version of an internet fight that you would have today with people calling each other out. Using a little bit more civil language than you may find in a blog post or a Facebook post. But I think he calls him an idiot several times in this book. So that's always fun to see people writing hundreds of years ago and still being salty with their language. So these are the kind of source text at the very beginning of the arguments of Calvinism and Reformed theology. And my argument is that when taken to their logical conclusion, that man's reason is so corrupt that he cannot do good, and he cannot even recognize good. That if that is true, then man should not be allowed to rule himself. And that the logical conclusion of Calvinism is anti-democratic, anti-republic, anti-elections, things like that. That if you take what they say in these books completely, literally, and start to argue from them, you will reach the conclusion that a theocracy is the only thing that can save man. And that is borne out in the life of Calvin when he lived in Geneva, Switzerland. He established a form of theocracy, which was a problem for people who like to defend Calvin, because they did some pretty horrific things. They drowned people who they considered to be witches. They beheaded some children who they considered to be disobedient to their parents to such a degree that they were irredeemable, and a whole host of other atrocities that, in my mind, are irreconcilable to a true interpretation of what Christianity is supposed to be about. So there's a lot of defense of Calvin on the Reformed, that he really didn't have a part in that, those judgments or those decisions, that was the government of the town. But the way that he set up the government, the councils were pretty much directly influenced by his ideas and his judgments of how things should be adjudicated. So that was then. Then there's a whole host of documents that I have on my iPad that I have not been able to find paper books for, which is basically contemporary interpretations of Calvin, basically laying out that exact argument, reestablishing a very severe, strict biblical law that should govern mankind. The first man who wrote is called Von Til, and the man who took his writings and wrote a much more practical application of a theocracy, his name is Rushdoony. So I don't have those in paper form. So it is as interesting a read as you can imagine. But along with them, there was a Christian writer called Francis Schaeffer, and he was very critical of Western Renaissance thinking that relied on human reason, that established the scientific method. The beginning of the Renaissance was around the same time as the beginning of the Reformation. They kind of sprang from the same desire to pull away from the strictures of the Catholic Church, whereas the Reformation wanted to pull away from the strictures of the Catholic Church when it came to worship and religion. The Renaissance wanted to pull away from the strictures of the Catholic Church when it came to academic studies and how one conducted academic studies. Up until that time, the works of Aristotle had pretty much been distilled down into this very formulaic way in which academic studies were conducted, and that was called scholasticism. And it worked for a while to describe certain things. But as the Renaissance began to flourish and more writings were discovered, particularly the writings of Plato and other Greek and Roman philosophers and historians and playwrights, the well-rounded intellectual of the day began to realize that there was more to humanity than what the Catholic Church was saying. And so you have people like Descartes and the beginnings of Western philosophy, which put us down a road of scientific discovery, personal discovery, basically the beginnings of the Western civilization. And there are plenty of critiques of that, and many of them are justified. These people were not perfect. But at the same time, we also have a very steep criticism of them from this Reformed theology. Because obviously, if man is starting to think, man is starting to reason, there is trust that is being put in the ability of man to figure out his environment, to catalog the world around him, to make a thesis, test that thesis, and use reason to come to a logical conclusion, which is the establishment of science and thought and everything that kind of our Western American society is built on. Obviously, Reformed theology has a big problem with that in the over-reliance on human reason, and will deny that human will and human reason is even a thing that can be used to make any sort of rational decision. So this is a book from Francis Schaeffer, which kind of establishes his view of reason from a critique of what became classical liberalism, which is where our democracy comes from, our view of the republic, are basically our confidence that man can rule himself. So the word liberal has changed a little bit in American society nowadays, where it is kind of tied very closely with the Democratic Party. But the classic view of liberalism was basically liberating human thought from the strictures of what it was bound to in the Middle Ages. So that's a very rough summary of what is classically meant by the word liberal. And so oftentimes the critique, when we hear the critique of liberalism today, some people mean a critique of the Democratic Party, but oftentimes it is also, that critique is carried backwards to critique the very foundations of the liberal democracy that we enjoy here in America. So this is kind of a contemporary critique of Western thought, liberal Western thought, from a more Reformed Calvin viewpoint. But Schaeffer was no dummy. He was very smart, and he established a school of thought in the 50s and 60s, ironically in Switzerland. And that's a whole nother way of, a whole nother video if I was going to go into that. But it's basically saying that rationality in Western philosophy has been not necessarily a good thing, and it has been pulling us in a bad direction away from Christianity. And then we have this book, which is a much more contemporary book. This was written only a few years ago, which basically takes a lot of the things of Rushdoony and Schaeffer and basically condenses them down into something that the average person can read, and is very screechy and very anti-Western democracy, Western thought, very anti-reason, basically saying that from the very beginning, these people that we would normally consider to be great thinkers of Western civilization were in fact apostates who were pulling us away from God, and we should not be listening to them or anything. So this is kind of on the very edge of the type of logic that I am talking about. And it is a very short jump from this to things like flat earth theory, anti-vaccination, and their extreme foundation of we don't need to have reason, and we don't have to trust science, and we can basically do whatever we want in the face of logical, scientific evidence. We discount that. We don't trust it because it is based on Western thought and science. And there is a deep divide amongst contemporary evangelical Reformed Christians who want to hold to certain ideas about the world that are being directly challenged through science. Specifically about things like evolution and things like that. Which leads to things like flat Earth, and I have a big problem with that. And so a lot of my work that I'm doing in my paper is to counteract this type of thinking when it comes to Christianity and go back and critique this a bit and say there may be some good things here in the original work of Calvin, but there is a different way of thinking about it. And so that is going to be the second part of my paper. So I have another stack of books. I hope that you are finding this relaxing, or at least this is putting you to sleep. So this next stack of books, there's 3 of these here, and there's more, but these are kind of representative of this phase of my paper. I am establishing the fact that human reason does exist, that it is a gift from God to us, and that when we deny it, we are denying a part of us that God gave to us to use. So, this book is a series of essays which I ran across at a antique bookstore, and I fell in love with some of these essays, particularly about the ones about American culture, which is the first essay in here. And he talks about how do we use language to understand our culture. And then the second essay is called The Trouble with Translation. And he talks about how when we are working with translated works, we have to be very careful that we understand that the translator is also interjecting a bit of himself, and he cannot help it because he has to make decisions when he translates from one language to another. And some of those decisions may actually help illuminate the text better, and some of those decisions may actually impede the understanding of the text. So I'm using this as a way to talk about when we look at Scripture, we are looking at a translation. And we are not looking at the original words, which is something that Calvin acknowledges. So that is my first line of argument, is that if we are going to put so much trust into a document like the Scriptures that we want to establish a government around it, can we be sure that we are right when we are working with translations? Because when you start talking about governments, you start talking about impacting people's lives in severe ways. So that we must be very careful. It's not just theoretical anymore. It is very practical. And this book is called The Authority of Reason. And it is a more scientific approach. It is not a Christian or theological approach, but it is a very systematic analysis of how the human brain works, how the human mind works, and can we establish the fact that reason is something that man has, that he can use. And when I say man, I mean all of humanity, man and woman. One of the struggles I'm going to have with writing this paper is using language that is inclusive when I am talking about all of mankind. Instead of like this particular man or this particular woman, it's a lot easier to use pronouns like they that are more inclusive. But when you're talking about all of humanity, most of the words that we use in the English language to describe that set of people have either slightly or significant masculine connotations. So that is a discussion I'm going to be having with my advisor around language and how to use words like mankind or humanity. Do we need to come up with a new word? So anyway, if I'm using those words as I'm talking, that is why. This is a problem that I'm still trying to figure out how to solve. And the reason that this book was written is because there is a kind of counterpoint argument that is not based on religion, but is based on Western thought of other Western philosophers that come from a type of philosophy called determinism, which basically says humans do not have a will because humans are just animals, and that we have the illusion of will, but we do not really have reason and will. It is all just electrical signals, and it's very reductionist and very much basically saying we are just mammals who happen to understand that we think. And so this is a book written against that type of reductionist and deterministic theory, basically saying there is reason and there is an authority of reason, and that it stems from the will, and that there is a such thing as free will. And so this is kind of another way of looking at my argument outside of the religious context that I can bring in and use some of the very scientific, logical progressions, so that while this book is written not exactly targeting the same audience that I am, it is close enough that I can definitely use many of the reasoning and the arguments in here. This is an awesome book. I actually checked this out of the library, liked it so much that I purchased it. And along those same veins, this is a book called Shadows of the Mind. And it is approaching it from a much more biological standpoint. And it is written by an academic that was the advisor to Stephen Hawking. And it is very speculative, but the basis of this book is trying to establish a biological, scientific proof of consciousness outside of the purely electrical signals that travel through our nervous system and our brain. And so, while I don't necessarily pretend to understand everything that is in this book, I intend to use this book to prove that there is research being done that could potentially lead to the fact that there is something about our consciousness that is not bound purely to our electrical meat brains, but also is not trying to use some sort of other spirituality that is actually grounded in scientific observations. And that's what this book does. It postulates that there is a quantum aspect to the way the electrical signals are handled in certain areas of our brains that point to the fact that there may be quantum mechanics that are influencing and are being influenced by the electrical signals in our brain, and that there are certain phenomena that our brains perform and certain tasks that our brains perform that cannot be explained purely by viewing the brain as an electric circuit or as a just really fancy computer. So this book attacks that problem. It also attacks the problem of, will we ever be able to make artificial intelligence from a computer? Which this book is saying no, because there is something additional to our consciousness that cannot be accounted for or must be taking in other scientific aspects of quantum mechanics in order to understand. So this book is way over my head, but hopefully I will get enough out of it to be able to plug it into my argument. And we have one more stack of books that I'm going to pull up now. And this is going back into a more Christian theology. We have some C.S. Lewis and we have some other Christian theologians that have been writing over the last 100 years or 200 years, counteracting the Reformed Calvinist viewpoint of the nature of God and man. This is a much more sane critique of Western thought as it has developed through time, that is able to critique Western liberal thought without completely throwing it out, and at the same time establishing the fact that there is a set of truths that can be known, as opposed to the views of existentialism or some of the other more modern philosophies of Nietzsche, which basically says we can't know anything, why do we even try? And tries to then establish a moral framework for man based on the fact that there is no place for us to know anything for certain, which usually ends up in a complete mess or leaning back towards the more strict, rule-based, black and white thinking that is echoes of something like Calvinism, although they would never see it that way. So this is a short little book that talks about how we process language and how we talk about the internal things that go on inside of us and how we interpret those. Specifically when we're talking about feelings and reason and motivations as to why people think things and feel things. And that there is more to man's brain and man's understanding than a purely rational, logical, kind of bloodless reasoning that oftentimes comes from existentialism. This is a book that was referenced in one of my other books, and I have not read this yet. It is a critique of Calvin and his view of the will and reason, and the fact that we are able to recognize good, and that we are able to actually do good, and that if God requires something of us, then he must give us the ability to fulfill that requirement. The boiling down of that is called ought implies can. If you ought to do something and is required of you, then the logical conclusion is that you have the ability to do that. If you do not have the ability to do it, whether it is a certain task or moral standing, then you should not be held responsible if you can't do it because you do not have the ability. So that if we are saying that we are required to act a certain way, we must have the ability to choose to act that certain way. So that will help establish my pushback a little bit. But I also want to not just be all negative, I want to be positive. And so I want to say that man can do good, man can recognize good, man can accomplish good, even if that good is not directly tied to his salvation. It is tied to his ability to make his world a better place. And I'm calling that morally efficacious good. And so then I will start to build the frameworks of a system that looks at Christianity and looks at the relationship between God and man in a very different light than the way Calvin and Luther established their theology. And a lot of that is based on looking at the underlying aspects of Christian faith that are very Platonic in their viewpoint. Now, that is not to say it is Neoplatonism, which is a whole other thing and a whole other video. But there are certain foundational aspects of Christianity that are undeniably mirrored in the philosophy of Plato. Specifically when he talks about in the Republic that he uses the analogy of man being in a cave and isolated from the true nature of the world. Basically being isolated by his senses, that there are things outside of our senses that we cannot comprehend because we cannot even perceive them. And there is a world of perfection, a world of ideals that we can not understand or grasp unless the knowledge from that world is brought to us from someone outside of the cave. It's a very, very rough explanation of that aspect of his philosophy. And that has been talked about throughout the ages. And that's kind of where Neoplatonism kind of takes that and carries it to an extreme that is also not helpful. So I'm trying to understand and talk about that philosophy without taking it to the extremes that people have taken it throughout history. And so that starts with the theology of people like the Cambridge Platonists, who tried to establish a Christian theology that took the philosophy of Plato and kind of viewed Christianity through that lens and vice versa, viewed Plato through the lens of Christianity. And so they are very difficult to read. They wrote in a time of English literature that was very flowery, and they particularly, as a group of writers, tend to write very flowerily, if that's a word. And so it's tough getting through and understanding kind of what they're talking about. So this book is kind of a summarization of their theology. And it was the exploration of the Cambridge Platonists years and years and years ago, even before I started doing my master's degree, that kind of started me on this road to begin with. So I want to use them at least a little bit in my book, or in my thesis. One of the main linchpins of how I'm going to approach this new way of thinking, or at least it's not new, it's like I invented it, but a counter way of another way of thinking about it, is looking at the works of Simone Weil, who was a writer in the 20s and 30s, I believe. And she was absolutely intelligent, amazingly smart, thought about the world in a very different way. She had a profound religious experience and kind of completely changed the way in which she wrote and thought about life. And she struggled with Christianity all of her life And out of that struggle came a tremendous amount of theological writings. And so this book is called Intimations of Christianity Among the Ancient Greeks. And so it also tries to draw the line between Platonist theology and viewing man from this way of thinking about them being trapped in a cave and needing to be brought knowledge and needing to be brought the understanding of how things work, which fits with the Christian view that in order for us to understand God, God himself had to come down and show himself to us. There is no way for us to be able to reason our way to him without being shown directly. And that is one of the reasons that I am a Christian, is that I believe that if there is something that is beyond us and beyond our comprehension, we cannot get there ourselves, but we must be shown it from the outside. And Christianity says that that happened, that God came and he revealed himself to us. And he did that out of love, and he did that out of sacrifice, and he did that out of the desire to reestablish a relationship with us that is based on finding value in us, and that the flow of love flows from God to us, and that there is grace and that there is forgiveness, as opposed to God is separate from us and we must in some way establish the link ourselves to him through keeping a certain law, keeping a certain set of regulations, keeping a certain mindset in order to prove our love to God, which I believe is ultimately impossible. So that kind of is a rough nutshell of my reasoning when it comes to my faith in Christianity. And Simone Weil is very much in agreement with that. And I will be using the works in here. I realize I'm not flipping through these books as much. I'm talking. So let me start flipping through pages. I apologize. When I get to talking about this, I kind of lose myself a little bit. But I'm hoping you're at least finding it interesting. And if not that you're at least finding it sufficiently dry enough to fall asleep to. But the conclusion of my paper is going to be the fact that we can do good, we can recognize good, and that our good is morally efficacious to the flourishing of our fellow man. And that when we look at Christianity and we look at our lives through that lens, we can prioritize being good over being right. And when I mean right, I mean certain. That there is and there has to be a certain amount of ambiguity when it comes to any sort of faith, whether it be Christian or Hindu or Muslim, that there is always the need for ambiguity, so that we will never be certain, and that our pursuit of certainty or our pursuit of being right can often cause more damage to our fellow human man and woman, because we've prioritized being right over being good, and that we need to flip that around and always make sure that we are keeping our ability to do good and our ability to recognize the good and our ability to evaluate our goodness and improve the ways in which we help our fellow man. That must be the goal, as opposed to being correct all the time. Now, that does not mean that we cannot strive to understand what is right. It does not mean that it is a vastly unknown territory. But it is simply a reordering of our priorities so that we make sure that we are not doing harm to our fellow man, either physically or psychologically or mentally or spiritually, in our desire to be right. And I think the ramifications of that open up the possibility for dialogue between two opposing sides. It opens up the possibility for compromise between two opposing sides. And it counteracts the polarization that we see, particularly in religion and particularly within politics in contemporary American culture. So, that, you now know, is a rough outline of the paper that I will be writing for the next 3 or 4 months until December, basically. I have a lot of outlines. I have a lot of notes. I have, as you can see, a lot of scribbling in books. And now you can see the thing that has been taking me away from making as many videos as I would like for you all. And so hopefully you see it as a worthy distraction from the videos. And I hope you found this interesting. I hope you have gotten at least some ASMR from it. If not, some relaxing time to unwind, decrease your heart rate, and listen to what I have to say. I'd be very interested in seeing what you guys think. I know if you're not coming from a religious or a Christian perspective, a lot of this may seem rather pointless, and I understand that. So if you would like to write a long comment about that, you're perfectly willing and welcome to do that. I ask that you just at least be kind and good in your reactions. If you have other thoughts about this from either a Christian standpoint, or if you are a Reformed, Calvin, evangelical Christian, let me know your thoughts as well if you would like. Or if you just want to say, hey, you can leave those comments as well. But if you haven't subscribed, please do. I will be trying to integrate a little bit more of my process through this paper into my videos and kind of bringing you along with me on the journey. Like I said, I want to do like an underlining video where I'm going through a book and underlining and making notes. The length of those videos is kind of a concern because it could take me several hours, and then I've got to edit it and stuff. So, but let me know what you think about that. And I will also be making other videos, so it won't be 100% dry theology, academic talk all the time. But I wanted to share this little bit of my process and of my life and my experience with you all. So thank you for watching. And I will see you in my next video. Bye.